Welcome, everyone. I think we'll probably get going. It's great to have everyone here today in such numbers. I'm Killian Daly, the Executive Director at EnergyTag, and we're really excited to launch this report today with our friends at the Lantau Group about China's power sector and policy landscape for round-the-clock clean power. So, quick opening and context from EnergyTag. We'll launch the report. Then we'll pass over to the Lantau Group, who will go a bit deeper into the details. We'll have a panel discussion, and finally a Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up in about an hour and a half. So, EnergyTag, we are a global nonprofit based in Europe. And our goal is to enable clean electricity by enabling standards, markets, policies that effectively drive clean power around the clock, every hour, everywhere. So that is our kind of theory of change, and that's very much in line with some of the stuff we will be discussing today. All of this is kind of a journey that will happen over decades, and we believe we need to make sure we get the job started as soon as possible. We interact with many leading press, governments. We're also involved in some of the major global standard updates, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as it pertains to corporate carbon accounting. One message that has become quite clear, definitely for us in Europe, but also globally, is that if you're heavily reliant on fossil imports, that does hinder your energy security and ultimately your competitiveness. Homegrown renewable energy, especially when it's available when and where you need it, obviously is a great hedge against these risks. And renewable capacity is obviously on the rise. We in this report and more generally have a lot to learn from how China has built such a formidable fleet of renewable power and also enabled that around the world. Also must be said that in some markets, renewables are starting to face integration issues, things like curtailment. China produces over 60% of the world's renewables. One major trend we start to see is renewables and batteries are getting so much cheaper. And that's going to be game changing as they can be blended together to maximize the energy security and cost benefits of renewable energy. Also, as we look to how companies buy green energy, evolving towards these models that leverage batteries and renewables together will be very important. And robust markets are really, really key. This is the graphic from the IEA. The main point is here that in general, over time, renewables move from like feed-in tariffs to things like contracts for difference, and also to pure market mechanisms like power purchase agreements. And that's something that the IEA also sees happening in China. And so that means that we can all learn from each other globally and how to set up these markets in the most effective ways, ultimately to drive the most renewable investment. That is something we can all learn from each other on, and we hope this report contributes to. And negative pricing is something we see as a new reality globally. We see that in most major power markets now. You see it in places like Shandong province in China. In Europe, it's almost the norm now on sunny days like today, where pricing is negative throughout much of the day, as the grid is simply saying, I can't take any more solar without adding flexibility. And one issue sometimes that we have is some of the support schemes and market mechanisms don't really reflect the reality of renewable generation. We often look at things kind of annually. Companies can use solar credits produced in the middle of the day at nighttime rather than investing in batteries. And so we need to change the incentives as it becomes more and more important to think about the exact times when we want green energy to be available. Also, we see globally the carbon accounting rules for some companies are being updated. They have some credibility concerns that need addressing. And again, this is all about moving to more accurate reporting. It's not about going to 24/7 renewables straight away, but it is about ensuring that we're tracking and measuring things in a way that ultimately delivers the system outcomes of batteries and renewables that we want to see. And the basic fundamental fact that we need to think about when we think of renewable markets is let's think about how we align clean power markets, which are often settled monthly or annually, with electricity markets. Europe has moved to 15-minute settlement. China is moving to similar settlements in its spot markets. So aligning those green energy markets and those physical electricity commodity markets ultimately makes sense in the long run. We have a set of open source standards as well that enable this real-time energy tracking. We won't go into too many details here, but that is something that we work quite a bit on. And finally, it's important that we think about some of the best-in-class modeling on these topics. What if we move towards more hourly green energy sourcing? What does that mean? And the leading institutions in the world and the leading academic journals have shown that there's going to be, significant benefits to this approach, more decarbonization, better signals for storage, and overall more effective cost level integration of renewables at a system level. I'll quickly pass to my colleague Shailesh Talang, and then we'll come back to me for the report launch and move on from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Killian. So with the foundation which Killian has just built, probably you might have seen the new report from IRENA we just launched, the title 24/7 renewables. So this is really interesting report at a very interesting time. So this new report highlights like how rapidly falling solar, wind and battery storage costs are making reliable round-the-clock renewable electricity increasingly cost competitive across the globe. And especially this report basically talks about LCOE approach and shows the various costs discovered for firmed renewables across the world. We have a slide where we talked about that later. But basically, this is covered by various leading media publications such as Financial Times, the New York Times, etc., which demonstrate that firm renewables is coming, and this is the time of firm solar and wind, along with batteries or other storage devices, is becoming increasingly valuable to various stakeholders, including corporate consumers. So let's talk about 24/7 carbon-free energy. I mean, so Killian talked about the reality of the power market and how the attribute tracking system works currently and how it should be. 24/7 carbon-free energy topics comes into the picture most of the time within these hourly matching conversations. But this is often get confused that hourly matching is like achieving 24/7 CFE up to 100% of the total consumption which company can have. But that's absolutely not true. 24/7 carbon-free energy is a journey, and corporations can start it, as low as, just begin with doing hourly matching, and reach to certain percentage of renewables into their total consumption, and gradually move forward and achieve 100% CFE when most of the procurement options are available, and not now. Absolutely, this is like you can have multiple target years by that time. What matters for now is basically doing hourly matching and of clean energy generation with consumption to increase the credibility of corporate renewable energy sourcing, and then gradually move towards more advanced procurements. Competitive round-the-clock renewable energy is also coming everywhere in the world. And we just talked about IRENA report, which basically talks about the pricing. But here on this slide, you can see the round-the-clock clean energy is becoming increasingly available in various markets. Like the Masdar, you can see here, the $70 to $80 per megawatt hour rate is basically what discovered for 24/7. It's a world first 24/7 renewable energy project. What's the project proponent claimed? It is also coming to Philippines, where the solar PV is paired with energy storage device, and the round-the-clock clean energy is being procured. Also coming in India. India is basically known as round-the-clock clean energy. Government of India is coming up with tenders to it's a utility scale procurement where the energy is procured at in real time, matched at 15 minutes interval, and the cost is as low as $70 per megawatt hour. And this is increasingly coming down, and in various markets to basically demonstrating that clean and firm renewables is available at lowest possible cost. So when we look into IRENA report, which is basically a recent report, talks about how the LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, looks like for round-the-clock clean energy, and especially for China. So China already, China is established a lot of renewable assets already, and this is basically now to go for more round-the-clock clean energy. We all know that China can implement things at scale, and renewable energy is not an exception. We see gigawatt scale renewable energy already installed. So basically, this is to enable round-the-clock clean energy. Basically, we need to unlock the right incentives in the market. We need the right market structure, which David will focus more on. But overall, when we look into the firm LCOE pricing, it basically in China moves from $54 per megawatt hour in 2025 to it can go up to $37 per megawatt hour in 2030. And similarly, this approach, this cost is looks similar in other markets like in India as well. Of course, in India has slightly higher prices, like roughly $80 per megawatt hour to 54 by 2030. There are other examples of Brazil, Australia, and United States as well, as you can see on this chart. Basically, the point is the cost of firm renewables is coming down and is becoming available in various markets. So now we come to the point where probably you might have these questions already, like why this report? There's multiple information available about the Chinese power market and various other procurement methods. But basically, this report, there are basically 4 reasons, as you can see here. The first one is China has built renewables at scale, and we all know that. But the next challenge is for integrating that renewables into the power system and considering like flexibility and like demand side flexibility, for example, and system optimization, so that more and more variable renewables can be integrated into the power system. So this is the time. The other thing is shared learning. Like as we know, the China renewable energy scale is immense, and then it matters globally. However, there are international experiences which can be utilized to help developing future market pathways, and this particular report talks about that, like how it can be done. One of the great example is like Europe built a lot of renewables, but ignored for at least for some time the flexibility elements to it, and now these kind of learnings can be looked into, and new systems, new more advanced systems which supports round-the-clock clean power can be looked into for the Chinese power market. Also, global carbon accounting rules, supply chain rules are evolving, such as carbon border adjustment mechanism or carbon accounting standards such as greenhouse gas protocol and others are also changing and increasingly incorporating granular electricity accounting. I meant the hourly matching of clean energy generation with consumption. This is also coming up, and that impacts thousands of companies, including companies based in China. So that is also a reason to look into these aspects in detail and take actions in time. And China's energy market transition is already visible. Like stakeholders already recognize the need to align with renewable energy growth. Market reforms are already introduced last year, and now need to look into like flexibility, how we can take into account, how we take into account energy storage, and also look into how corporations, especially procuring renewable energy, can make renewable energy claims in a credible manner. So looking into all these aspects, this particular report addressed these points in detail, which David will be explaining in detail in this webinar today. So with that, I request Killian to come in for the report launch.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that, Shailesh. Okay, so now we will launch the report, give you the access links. So we're again, very happy and thankful to work with the team at the Lantau Group on this report. I would also like to underline, I think something really fundamental is that we have learned a huge amount doing this report, and we do hope there's some elements from our global experiences that people working in China can also learn and from this report. So it's really a two-way street in that sense. We have two QR codes here. There's an English version and a Chinese version of the report. So we have in two languages that can also be found on the publication section of EnergyTag's website. The Lantau Group team will also share a QR code later on in the webinar that is based on Tencent, so it might be slightly easier for people in China to use that link. You can always reach out to us by email if you have any issues downloading the report. So there you go. We're very excited to share this all with you and to hear any feedback that you might have. Finally, for us, please do reach out to EnergyTag. Shailesh is our head of Asia Pacific. There is his email. Annie is our APAC market analyst who also speaks Mandarin if people prefer to chat in Mandarin rather than in English. And we have a couple of QR codes, of course, as well for WeChat, which we know is the main medium of communication in China. So I think that's it from us. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll welcome David Fishman from the Lantau Group, who will run through some of the key findings of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shailesh. And thank you, Killian. I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. All right, very good. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're very pleased to be launching our presentation today. So today, I do want to note we've had some messages shared in the chat. If you are joining us and you would prefer a different language, we have enabled simultaneous captions and interpretation for this meeting. You just go up to the More button on the top of your screen, select Language and Speech, and then go to simultaneous interpretation or instant captions, and that will give you the option to select between different languages if you would prefer to use a different language. Okay, so we're going to be trying to condense what is a fairly long report that we just put out together with EnergyTag into a fairly short presentation. We've got just about 15-20 slides here to try to cover what is a much longer report. So I will have to get through some of the material perhaps quicker than I'd like to, but I do hope that we get to communicate the basic points of the report here. So trying to explain first in a broad context why round the clock or 27 clean power is so important. Let's take a look at this first characteristic here, this first scenario, the annual matching scenario that we describe. So suppose you have an industrial facility like a shopping mall or a factory that consumes 12,000 megawatt hours of electricity in 1 year. And if they want to claim to be green electricity right now, what they have to do is buy 12,000 megawatt hours of green electricity. Now, if 12,000 megawatt hours of green electricity are generated in the world somewhere, and that factory claims 12,000 megawatt hours of green electricity, it is common under our current frameworks to say that this facility is now 100% green on an annual basis, right? We have matched consumption and generation annually. But in reality, if we think about what type of electricity that facility was consuming at 2 a.m., on a not very windy night, we can say probably there was no sun, there was no wind, there was no hydropower. So in that hour, in that moment, they were consuming not green electricity. This is the essential background of the push for 24/7 or granular accounting and granular matching for green electricity. So if we consider the bottom example here, on the generation side, we're imagining a scenario where in every single hour of the 24 hours, some generation was green and was being fed into the grid. Maybe it was solar, maybe it was wind, or maybe it was storage that was charged using solar or wind or hydropower. And then we need to be able to match the generation side to the consumption side to say that in every single hour that the power user used power, it was a green megawatt hour of electricity corresponding to the generation side. So granular matching or 24/7 carbon-free energy can help address some issues that are typically starting to appear when a power system has a lot of renewables in it. So let's talk about this. For these first three groups of stakeholders, for your generators, for your storage operators, and for your system operators, they really benefit from sharper price signals. Now, what do I mean when I say sharper price signals? For generators, every single hour of the day has different prices for green power. If you're a power generator, you would like to know that certain hours of the day are already very supplied, highly supplied, or maybe even oversupplied with green electricity, while other hours of the day are undersupplied. So at noon, all the solar power is generating. Should the value of the solar power be lower? I think we can probably agree, according to market fundamentals, the answer is yes. But if you have a demand from a customer who wants to buy green electricity at 2 a.m., should the value of that 2 a.m. megawatt hour of green electricity be higher? I think that would also be true, again, according to scarcity. So for generators, 24/7 granular matching allows a price signal that says which hours are more valuable to supply electricity and which hours are less valuable to supply electricity. These sharper price signals also help out storage operators. After all, you can't move that oversupplied noon hour of electricity to 2 a.m. without a storage operator participating, right? You need batteries or you need some other type of storage. And so if you are a storage operator, that sharper price signal tells you when and where to build that storage so that you can move that megawatt hour around to a time period when it is needed. And then for system operators, I mean, all of high renewable penetration systems typically have problems related to load following, the so-called duck curve. They might have high congestion in certain hours. And so you need your generators and your storage operators to engage in certain types of behavior to help smooth out all the stress that's being placed on the grid. And so when you have more hourly matching regimes, you're creating more price signals, and they're, doing their work, but they're also helping out you as the system operator. And then finally, the power buyer. For the power buyer's perspective, they're going to be worried about compliance, and they're going to be worried about meeting certain mandates, especially when it comes to international trade, where the requirement is already becoming more strict in some cases, and where they have to demonstrate that they consumed green electricity, not on an annual or a monthly basis, but in every hour of a 24-hour cycle. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but at some point in the future, that will become the standard. And for them, having such a system in place is the only way that they will be able to maintain compliance. So let's take a look at where China is today. It's important to understand when we talk about the Chinese power system that it's coming from a very different place than many other power markets in the world. China is not the United States, it's not Western Europe. China is the Chinese power system. We have what is essentially a highly centralized governance system for the power market, and then a mostly unbundled in function power segment. So when I say unbundled, I mean generation, transmission, and power sales are already separate functions. However, a lot of the governance and organization is still very centralized, and it still is a partially regulated segment from the top level. So we have, in the generation segment, you have state-owned enterprises. You also have independent power producers, including foreign entities that can invest in, own, and operate power generation, wind, solar, no problem, even a coal plant if you want to. The transmission and distribution is still entirely concentrated inside had the state-owned grid companies, a natural monopoly, right? There's two major ones and one smaller one. And then power sales is increasingly liberalized or unbundled as well, where you have, gentailers, so the major generators can set up their own retailing entities. We have independent retailers who are really just buying and selling power on margin, and the grid company in some cases serves as a retailer. We can call it maybe a grid tailer in this case, where they are serving certain customer classes that are protected from the markets. For example, residential power customers and certain types of commercial and industrial. So China today still has a very hybridized system, but it is rapidly moving towards what we would consider internationally to be a relatively liberalized or unbundled power segment. Now let's talk specifically about the role of green electricity certificates. So China only has GECs now. Previously, there were other types of green attribute instruments that could be used to demonstrate green power generation or consumption, but now everything has been bundled into the GEC, the sole attribution instrument for green electricity in China. It is recognized both for domestic mandatory compliance purposes, for example, for the Renewable Portfolio Scheme, which mandates certain minimum consumption quotas for green electricity in specific industries. And then also it is accepted for international voluntary compliance programs, for example, RE100 claims or any other corporate compliance program. You can use GECs for that as well. 1 GEC equals 1 megawatt hour of electricity. So GEC prices have been coming down rapidly in recent years. They have, in fact, crashed in the last 2 years or so, originally reflecting a relative state of scarcity between the green electricity supply and demand, and then in recent years with green electricity supply expanding more rapidly than demand, really pushing the price of a GEC in China down to just pennies. We're looking at 4 yuan for a single megawatt hour of green electricity in China. Meanwhile, the GEC trading volumes are still rising. We're seeing incredibly rapidly rising trading volumes as those quotas continue to rise and as voluntary compliance programs continue to embrace and accept the GEC, but the supply continues to expand much, much more rapidly than the demand has, and that's led to very weak prices for the GEC. So let's take a look at what the GEC is now, and then what the GEC would have to be, or what something else would have to be in order to become an hourly instrument. So GECs right now are monthly instruments. That means a megawatt hour of solar or wind, when it's generated, is only attached with the specific month in which it was generated in China, not a day, not an hour. And so if you wanted to do hourly matching or 24-hour clean electricity claims, you need to have a certificate or an instrument that shows an hourly timestamp. The GEC, of course, it's not a failing that the GEC doesn't show hourly timestamps, because the system that exists right now that the GECs are used for does not demand them to be hourly. But in the future, if an instrument is needed to prove hourly green consumption, then it also needs to be an hourly instrument. Another feature of GECs currently is that they don't have different premiums for different times of day of generation. Again, they couldn't possibly, right? They are associated with a single month, not a specific hour. But if we want a green attribute instrument to start serving that purpose of passing on price signals that a megawatt hour of solar power at noon should probably be priced very differently from a megawatt hour of solar at 2 a.m., then we need the ability to show different green premiums at different times of the day. By the same token, there's no price signal there for storage, right? If you want a storage operator to be able to charge with green electricity and discharge that green electricity at a different hour of the day, you need to actually be pricing different hours of the day and creating demand for it from the power buyer's side. Otherwise, there's no need for such an instrument to fill that role. And then finally, we have this interesting point about emissions, right? The point, of course, of consuming green electricity in certain hours of the day is to lower your indirect emissions, your electricity-associated emissions for your products that you produce. If you have 100% green, then you should be able to say your electricity electricity emissions have gone down to very, very low levels, or even zero in some cases. But in a granular matching scenario, every hour in a 24-hour cycle ideally should be seeing a different emissions exposure. And that would only be possible if you have certificates that are able to be timestamped as well. So here's just some of the roles about how GECS would need to evolve in order to get to something that would meet more of an hourly need. Again, not a specific indictment on the GECS, just an observation that hourly instruments have a different application and therefore need to have different features as well. So let's take a look at some of the drivers on the Chinese side for why this would need to be pursued or why this would be interesting at all. The most obvious one that you've probably thought of before is CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a carbon border levy that is assessed on any goods entering the EU from outside the EU. We can call it a carbon border tax. I know it sometimes is sensitive to call it a tax, but that's what it is, right? A carbon border tax that if embedded emissions of goods produced in China have higher embedded emissions than those same goods to be produced in the EU, then they will pay a tax on those embedded emissions. Now, there are certain ways to reduce that carbon exposure to demonstrate that you were consuming green electricity or that you were offsetting those emissions in another country. Now, electricity is slowly moving into something that is covered by CBAM. Some industries are covered right now, some are not. But in the future, we would expect to see a lot more industries covered and a lot more of those emissions associated with electricity covered as well. So as CBAM's scope continues to expand, we would expect to see more Chinese exports affected by CBAM and then more exporters affected by CBAM, more Chinese producing entities looking for a way to mitigate their emissions in a way that is recognized by the CBAM and by the European Commission. And that means we have to pay close attention to how CBAM itself is evolving. So again, electricity today, electricity is covered under CBAM, but that deals with electricity imports, like direct cross-country imports. That's not really a factor for China. What we're really focusing on here is embedded emissions, indirect emissions through the electricity that was consumed to produce products. Currently, just cement and fertilizers, which both aren't very large export areas from China to the EU, but coming soon, other high energy intensive industries like steel and aluminum. And also, as the scope expands from just those primary materials to all goods made out of steel and aluminum, we would expect to see a lot of exposure on the Chinese side for exporters that have incurred emissions on the Chinese side and need to find a way to mitigate them or demonstrate that they have actually not incurred those emissions by using renewable electricity instead by the time they export. Otherwise, they're going to need to pay at the border. So that's where it's heading, right? Many different categories of manufactured goods out of aluminum, out of steel will also be subject to CBAM assessments and auditing in the near future, starting from 2028. And at that point, we would also expect to see, on a similar timeline, the embedded electricity production also becoming a factor. This means that if you are based in China producing for the EU, you've got to be thinking about how to meet their requirements. And crucially, all of the requirements we're seeing so far for the correct way or acceptable way to reduce your electricity embedded emissions require hourly matching, or that there are hints that it will require hourly matching. And so that means it's just not enough to buy green power annually matched or monthly matched. It's going to need to be 24/7 green electricity on the Chinese side, auditable and verifiable in order to receive credit for that when it comes to calculating your CBAM exposure. So what type of system will actually make that possible? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to first direct your attention to the left side of the slide where I talk about CBAM emissions for the electricity that's used in products. So you can see in the middle, we've got our CBAM product. It could be anything. Let's imagine it's a battery, okay? And so what type of electricity was used to create that product? Well, you have different options. The grid average, the default, right? If you're not buying any special green electricity, then the grid average is what you use. But if you are buying some green electricity, for example, through a PPA, or maybe you have a direct line connection to a renewable facility, then you would start to take the weighted average of all of your different sources of electricity. Of course, the goal is to reduce your incurred emissions so that your weighted average is lower, and then your calculated emissions are lower when it comes to looking at CBAM. But notice in both the PPA option and the direct line option, there is this hourly matching requirement that for those to count and for you to get credit for them, there will need to be an hourly matching component. Again, not this year, not next year, but coming soon, coming certainly by around 2028, we would expect. Now let's go to the right side. What type of framework would actually work to make an hourly matching system work? Remember, the existing Chinese GECs right now are not hourly matched. Maybe they could be in the future, but for the moment, they are not. So this is an example of a framework that has been promoted and distributed by EnergyTag that explains how to kind of link together hourly consumption and production in the absence of an hourly instrument that exists already. Kind of central to all of this is this middle part. We call it the matcher, right? The matching system in the middle. You need to create some type of in-between entity or a mechanism that is able to match what's going on the power production side and the power consumption side. On the power production side, this megawatt hour of green electricity now needs to know exactly what hour it was created. We need to know exactly where it was created, and we need to know when that facility began operating to make sure it's compliant. On the consumption side, the same thing. We need to know exactly when the power was consumed and where the power was consumed. This is the only way to start matching together the production and the consumption of the green electricity. When we have those two things together, the matcher might be able to issue a new instrument that can serve that purpose. Maybe a granular certificate, a GC is what we're calling it here. And then those granular certificates could be either a new product, or it could be layered on top of the existing certificate system like a GEC. And that would allow a verifiable claim to be made about green consumption that would meet that export exposed CBAM compliant world that we're talking about here. Beyond just the exporters, moving towards a more granular, sensitive world could also help a lot of other players just in the power grid, stakeholders in the power market. So we have here on the left side a kind of typical normalized power supply curve, right? Our blue peaks represent in a non-granular matching world what type of power curves we would expect to see. This is quite normal, right? If we're not doing granular matching, we're just doing kind of annual or monthly matching. Load changes throughout the day, right? We have our low period, our green periods happen from about 8 p.m. to around 5 a.m. And then we see a big spike of power demand. Everybody's cooking breakfast. And then another spike of power demand in the evening. Everybody gets home, turns on the AC, starts cooking dinner, right? If you're trying to incentivize battery storage to do something about that, ideally, after you build enough storage, your load curve looks more like that gray line, right? The system demand with storage. Notice how we flattened out those peaks, and we've also pulled up those troughs, so we have a much more flat load curve throughout the day. But if you want storage to do that, if you want storage operators to build that, you have to incentivize them, right? The gap between the load peak and the load trough and our ideal curve is the value that we hope our storage operators are going to capture, right? They have to be incentivized to do that. And so this is where we get some real more deep look at how hourly matching helps storage operators understand where to build the storage and how much of it. And when we're talking about hour storage, we're talking about helping generators, because of course, if they have, if they're generating at the wrong time, they're not able to capture enough value. And then we're talking about the market operator, right? The market operator is surely happy to smooth out some of those peaks, fill in some of those troughs, and get a little bit more of a consistent load throughout the day. So here we're saying this causation is that more granular price signals are allowing your system operator, your generators, and your and your storage operators to deploy assets more effectively. Certainly, we could imagine this might be helpful in a place like Shandong province, right, which currently still is experiencing some pretty severe peak and trough deltas between daytime power prices when the solar is all overperforming, and then evening prices when the solar disappears, demand spikes, and solar goes away. Storage is getting built, but maybe not quickly enough. How could we get more storage built? Maybe this type of more granular price signal would help storage to get built. So I do want to talk about what's going on in China now. The interesting pilots that are underway. No doubt the most advanced pilot right now in the country is in Jiangxi province. Jiangxi, a bit of an interesting place to have such an advanced pilot, but as of last year, Jiangxi is now already formally trialing an hourly green power matching scenario. Now, keep in mind, right now, what Jiangxi is doing is mostly focused on helping their exporters, helping their green power buyers create a granular matching system that allows them to export and make auditable claims about their green power consumption. They're pretty early stage in their trial, and they're not really carrying out this trial right now with the intention of creating more granular price signals, helping out storage operators, right? It's one step at a time. But they did hold this pilot last year, and it was focused on helping renewable generators match with renewable buyers, and that an auditable claim can be made on an hourly basis. Now, Jiangxi is probably because, well, they've got quite a bit of exposure to both batteries and solar panels. But the batteries are the really interesting one. There's a lot of battery supply chain players in Jiangxi, and they are surely keeping an eye on their exposure via their exports to the EU. Not necessarily through CBAM, but through the battery regulation, which is also taking a close look at the embedded emissions in the batteries coming out of China going to the EU. So Jiangxi is currently carrying out the first nationwide trial on a very large provincial basis. There have also been some enterprise level or company level pilots, right? Individual corporations in Shandong or in Guangdong that work with a generator and a retailer to provide them a kind of bespoke solution to hourly matching. So this is what you do when you don't have a provincial level pilot and a mechanism ready. You can also pursue it on an individual basis. Of course, it's much more complicated, but it is possible, and we are seeing some of these pilots happening now on an individual enterprise level. And then finally, I do want to flag that Jiangsu, as of its most recent power trading rules of just a couple months ago for its medium long-term trading, does appear to be getting ready for enabling this kind of hourly clean power trading in their medium long-term market. But it's still very early stage. We'll see where that goes. So fine, I'll go through this recommendation slide quite quickly because I do want to be conscious of time here. But to scale up what we're seeing already. Now, of course, Jiangxi is already going ahead with some pilots, but there's a lot of other provinces that are just thinking about it or not even thinking about it at all yet, right? But across 3 different levels of stakeholders, we need to see a lot of activity and everybody working together to make hourly matching more possible, especially for their exposed exporters. Anybody exporting to the EU has to be thinking about this. So even from the very early stages of defining what is hourly matching going to mean for our province, for our municipality, or for our grid, who is going to be able to access the data. Usually that's going to be the grid or the power exchanger's responsibility. And then retail, right? Actually, a lot goes through the retail sector. They have to be willing to offer some of these solutions to the power buyers. And then building all the way through our 5 phases. Now, you can get into all of these 5 phases in a lot of detail in the report that we just published with EnergyTag. And again, we'll share that link. Now, you can see, for example, Jiangxi is probably already at phase 4. For its policymakers, retailers, and the grid company, right? They're already piloting their first one, but most other provinces in China are maybe at phase 1, or maybe they haven't even started yet. It varies widely across the country. So our conclusions here, just a high-level takeaway that Obviously, the momentum is here already. The renewables are expanding like crazy. The needs for storage are expanding like crazy, and the exposure to international compliance regimes are also growing. So as China is already facing its challenges with continuously scaling up renewables while also trying to find new sources of flexibility, it's very possible that hourly matching could be a new additional helpful tool in the toolkit that can help pass on some price signals, and of course, in the near term, especially help those exporters with their international compliance exposure through CBAM or other similar programs. So really, we say here the goal is just to make the accounting catch up with the physics. We know that at some times of the day, the green power is not green power. On a 24-hour cycle, we would like to be able to prove on an accounting basis that it all was green power, or maybe baby steps along the way with that as an eventual goal. But that's not to take away at all, of course, from the incredible achievements already so far in the Chinese power sector. This is just a potential logical next direction to go. So thank you for your attention. We do have another couple report download links here. That English version link leads to the EnergyTag website, but if it's too slow for you to load, you can also download both an English and Chinese version from a Tencent Cloud link that we've provided here for you. I'll pause for a few seconds to give you a chance to scan that with your phone. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you for your time. So this is Shailesh's contact on the left here, and this is my contact on the right. I am happy to be able to present this to you today, and certainly happy to respond to any questions in the Q&A session later. Thank you.
So I think it's the time to move to the panel conversation. So over to you, Jenny.
Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Jenny from IEC. I'm the expert of the TC8HC. So thank you for the colleagues from the EnergyTag and Lantau group and give us a very impressive and very interesting brief introductions of your report. So because the time is very limited, so I can skip some of the introduction of the panel discussion. So let's directly move into the questions. So the first question is for David. So it is about the China's power market evolutions. So as you introduced in your report, that China has already built enormous renewable energy capacity and deployment continues to accelerate rapidly, of course. So from David, your perspective, what is the next major challenge for China's power sector as renewable and the penetration increases? And in this focus now shifting from renewable deployment itself toward system integration, flexibility, and market design?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That's exactly correct. Moving from volume, which China has already proven substantially is not a problem, right? Building capacity, building lots and lots of capacity is clearly already just fine. But taking a look at the penetration level of the renewables now, right? As of 2025, wind and solar together are now 22% of China's generation, largest power sector in the world, and 1/5 of it is coming from intermittent renewables, which starts to create a lot of strain on the system, a lot of strain on the integration and flexibility needs, which are growing incredibly rapidly. So the next phase of Chinese renewable build-out has to be a deep committed focus on flexibility resources. It has to be storage, it has to be demand response, and it has to be all of the tools that enable more renewables to be built without creating more strain on the system. And so that's where we get back to the things we were just talking about in the presentation. How to build the storage, where to build the storage, what's the right price for the storage, what's the right price for the demand response. These are all questions that can only be addressed with really, really robust price signals. And so where do we get our very robust price signals? Perhaps hourly matching is going to be one of the answers to that.
Okay, thank you, David, for your introduction of that. So actually, we received multiple questions for the stakeholders and participants, and I think one thing they are really caring about is the current, annual, or like monthly matching and between the granularly matching. So the report also highlights that the China's power system already produces increasingly granular operational and settlement data. So while clean electricity procurement and environmental claims still mostly rely on monthly or like the annual averages. So in your opinion, how might it shape the next phase of the market revolutions? So from your perspective, David, and how might it be in the next phase?
Yeah, so when we're talking about, settlement data is already on an hourly basis, right? And yet the price signals that are eventually passed on downstream are quite limited, really, right? Most people contract most of their electricity on an annual basis or a monthly basis. So although we're creating temporal signals in the wholesale market, very little of that gets passed on to the exposure downstream, which makes it quite difficult actually for power buyers to respond to the market. That's one problem. If you want power buyers to respond in a certain way, for example, demand response programs, they need to be able to get updated, rapid information. But another aspect is you're asking your retailers to take on an awful lot of market risk, right? They are signing annual contracts with their power buyers, but then they're exposed to quite granular fluctuations in the wholesale power market where they're buying power. And it's reasonable to expect retailers to take on some risk, right? They're in business, right? They're trying to make money selling electricity, but that's an awful lot of risk to ask retailers to take on. If you want them to also be offering more flexible packages, you want them to offer more interesting products to buyers. So I think that's an important consideration. If you want your downstream stakeholders to be happy, you need to find a way to give them the ability to hedge against some of the already fairly granular outcomes that are appearing upstream.
Okay, thank you, David, for your the answer for all these questions. So let's move to the European, questions for that. Because building on the discussion around system integration and market evolutions, I'd like to bring in the European perspective here. So I think not only in China but around the world, and everybody is looking at Europeans regulations like the RFNBO and the CBAM. So increasingly emphasize hourly measurement and temporal matching requirements for renewable electricity produced through PPAs or like the granular certificates. So Kilian, this is questions for you because we know that maybe you are supporting some institutes from the Europeans and help them to emphasize and to build the whole regulation systems. So in your perspective or in your ideas, what are the main considerations behind these requirements, such as CBAM and RFNBO, and are they primarily intended to improve accounting credibilities and reduce greenwashing risks, or are they also designed to better align renewable electricity consumptions with actual power system conditions and decarbonization outcomes?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an interesting question. It's one I get asked quite a lot. Both is the answer. I think fundamentally, if you look at green hydrogen or FNBO, the policymakers want to make sure that this is a credible green hydrogen product. So, if you're using a solar attribute in the middle of the night to say that you're solar powered at night, this is going to raise credibility concerns, possibly with the public, about why public money or support schemes are going towards something like this. So the credibility is absolutely key. Similarly for CBAM, we want to make sure, I guess, that, in third countries, people should and can go out and buy clean electricity using power purchase agreements, but that is done in a credible way that is not disadvantaging either European manufacturing of these products. So the credibility is absolutely key. And obviously, credibility over time in a power system, as kind of has been mentioned, you need to get a bit more granular. You need to talk in these hourly type timeframes. The other thing that's linked to credibility, but is also absolutely critical, is making sure that when you set up a green accounting system, in a way, you're also setting up an incentive structure. Buyers are going to behave in a certain way to be greener, to pay less import tax, to produce more green hydrogen. And so it's important that that's done in a way that's system friendly. And so if you have these hourly signals, not only do you send signals for renewables, but absolutely crucially, you're sending signals for demand flexibility, for batteries, maybe for long duration energy storage, all of the things that we absolutely need to have a successful, cost competitive, renewable integration in Europe, or I guess ultimately anywhere. So it's really both of those things, Jenny, that matter.
Yes, and and also, we talked a lot with our Chinese stakeholders and the researchers here. And I think one thing they wanted to know is that, yes, we also knew that the JET Protocol Scope 2 is also under the process of revising, and also the C-band RFNBO, and even for the data, the energy efficiency for data centers also mentioned that 15 minutes, I think 15 minutes guarantees over regions. So we wanted to know that is there any potential for some degree of alignment, between the round-the-clock clean electricity standards and the EU's evolving approaches to electricity-related emissions accounting under CBAM or RFNBO. So I think it's very important for the enterprises. They wanted to know if they are using the RTC standards, whether they can also meet the, request from the CBAM or other, EU regulations. In your perspective, can you share with some your ideas?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I suppose if you look at a lot of global standards, they start with different ideas, maybe in different places. One group does an hour, other people do 15 minutes. I do think it's ultimately very important that we get to a point where there's a kind of a globally accepted standard way of proving hourly accounting or hourly matching. This is just going to make it easier for everyone. This is going to make it easier for trade rules or regulations that are relying on that we can kind of be sure that if you're doing that in Germany or Shandong or somewhere else in the world, that's more or less being done in the same way, and we can have kind of a common trust of that. This is obviously normal across many industries, and I think that would be desirable. And I think a number of those conversations are going on at the moment. So that's something certainly I would like to see.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I prepared another questions for you, Killian, but I think because the time is very limited, we have to, give enough time for our audience to ask the questions. So I will move to the next questions about the, the pioneer projects and the pathways in China. And this question, absolutely, I will ask the Shalish, because I know you focused more on the Asia Pacific regions, and based on your working experience, maybe in many countries, so you see a lot of pioneer projects, and you see a lot of conditions, and and the pioneer projects in each countries. So let's back to China. Beyond the international developments, another important question is what practical pathways may actually work in the Chinese market context, because the report discusses possible pathways for introducing more time resolved or real around-the-clock clean electricity procurement projects in China. But we wanted to know what is the pathways and how to implement such projects here, and what we need and what the worlds need, and for the industries and for the government, for the institutes need to do here in China to implement such pioneer projects or kind of standards.
Yeah. And thank you, Jenny. David and Killian already set the context for what I'm going to say. So I think that's good. Thank you. Thanks to them. So I think China does not need to build, RTC or 24/7 clean power system from the scratch. Even report highlights this, many enabling component already exist. And what is important is the challenge is integrating market reforms, clean energy attribute tracking, and enabling systems such as flexibility resources, such as on storage system, etc., and data system into a credible time-based clean pathways is basically what we need to implement. These are challenge, but also pose a lot of opportunity. Means we talked in detail in the report, actually, like starts with pilots, especially looking into some advanced provinces where the active spot markets exist already, where strong renewable penetration exists, or having better digital infrastructure for data tracking, and also there is enough or large consumer demand. And the second one is like upgrading, tracking infrastructure, like adding time attributes, maybe in the existing GEC system over time, to have like more granular time stamping and better linkage with like metered electricity data, etc. And most important ones is like integration of storage and flexibility as enabler to have this time result procurement. And last one is like improving access to time interval data, especially for corporate consumer. These are some of the elements which from the supply side, especially, or at the policy level, is what we need. But from the consumer side, I think that's your major question, is how to begin with. Is David talked about a few pilots, first pilot in China already, which basically includes using, a underlying instrument, which is green electricity certificate, paired with granular generation data. And then, basically, so environmental attributes in the form of GEC, paired with granular generation data from the generator, and taking that and matching with consumer's load. Assuming that consumer load data usually is available with consumer. I think that's the way forward to begin with, to at least start with hourly matching in the short term, and also gradually moving towards having more time differentiated products, like participation in the spot market, as well as procuring from renewable energy generation, which is backed with storage, so that you get firmed and dispatchable renewable energy, etc. These are some of the solutions to begin with, and we have seen that already happening in many markets. Actually, I think we've started with our presentation that round-the-clock clean energy, which is from solar plus storage or wind plus storage, is already becoming accessible and cost competitive along with the fossil fuels or other sources. So I think this is the way forward, both from supply and demand side, in the short and long term.
Okay, thank you, Shailesh. So the next questions might be sensitive. It's about the cost. But I decided to skip it because I believe that some audience will ask these questions during the Q&A sessions, because when we are talking about the hourly matchings or like 24/7 RTC, and everybody can, and the focus is on the cost, because based on a lot of research, it may increasingly and to give like the cost burdens to the and industries. But I skip this because I believe that some audience would like to ask you these questions. So the last question for you is about alignment, and the David in like his like introduction of the report said that the Chinese electricity market is very special, and is different from the EU electricity market as well as like the United States electricity market. So you as the organizations, developing the international RTC clean electricity standards. So how are differences in green electricity market structures and procurement method across regions? And also in particular, how can global comparability be balanced with practical feasibilities? And will credible region-specific approaches be taken into account? So I think that's our audience wanted to know, and how to build like the standards can also align the Chinese market situations and also the global electricity market situations.
Yeah, I think this question can be, I definitely I'll go up, but even Killian can add in from the global perspective if he wants. So I think this is very interesting question, because most of the stakeholders wants to know where is the alignment, and where Chinese clean energy procurement can meet the requirements of international standards. I think from a consumer's perspective, this is very important question. So in the presentation, we talked about various reporting standards such as GHGP, ISO, and others are currently under revision and already considering time matching elements, which is matching clean energy generation with consumption on hourly or sub-hourly basis. This is basically the requirement. This can be done using right now, you can see many case studies on our website. Actually, this is it's possible with the minimum resources as well. You can even do this matching in spreadsheets if you want, with matching generation with consumption, provided you have this granular data access from your utility. But the most sophisticated way to do it is going into renewable energy certificates, which has timestamp, which we call granular certificates. But most important part also want to highlight is nobody is expecting to go like 100% time matching from day one. Means I mentioned that in one of the slides. This is often get confused. You can start with 10%, 5%, whatever you can do. This is very, very important. And you can start as I meant a very simple terms like just matching using the spreadsheet as I highlighted. But if as the volume goes and when more sophisticated procurement options are available, such as granular certificates are nothing but energy attribute certificates, such as GEC in China, just with the timestamp on it. So if these are available, or it will become available probably in future, so corporations can, stakeholders can use that to match, to make time-based claims going forward. And that will basically help them to align with the global best practices. David highlighted how to do, CBAM compliance, though it is like very policy-related topics. But basically, what is required is CBAM PPAs, which is hourly matched. And that's basically the compliance. So if the power procurement options can be designed in such a way that meets international requirements, as well as meets the clean energy requirements locally, I think that's a win-win situation for stakeholders in China. Anything else, Killian, you want to add in?
No, maybe just to underline a point I made in the chat. I know we'll come to that again later, but the cost of doing hourly matching completely depends on how much matching you do. So doing 100% right now today, that is expensive, of course. Doing 80, maybe even 90%, the IEA finds that that's pretty much cost competitive with industrial retail tariffs in large economies. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. None of the regulations are forcing 100% hourly matching. We would never advocate for that to be forced on everyone tomorrow morning. And that's incredibly important to keep in mind. There are more elements. If anyone wants to reach out to us, we can talk through them, to do with hedging of exposure to electricity markets, and how actually PPAs with broader ranges of technologies much better protect you against volatile wholesale markets in terms of hedging. But that probably is a little bit technical for the introductory session. But this is incredibly important also.
Okay, thank you, Killian. And I think you've already given us some the examples and research from the IEA. And I don't know whether the audience could check. You can check the chat. Can I use Chinese? And Killian 给了大家一个那个 IEA 的报告，在那个聊天框里面能看到。所以就是大家可以去 check 一下那个 IEA 的那个报告。然后他的意思就是这个，因为成本是中国市场最关心的。然后它跟 Shalish 的意思就是说，这个取决于你的 hourly matching 的这个就是比例是多少。所以这个我觉得，因为成本是一个长期的话题，所以就大家可以去 check 一下那个报告。So thank you, Killian, and I've give some very simple explanations to the audience, for the Chinese audience, that they can check the IEAs and see whether it will affect their the cost or something. So actually the next question is for myself. It's about the CBAM, because in the Chinese market now we are facing the pressures from the CBAM. But yes, and at this stage, and because for some alumina and steel, the indirect emissions are not requested to report and to pay for that. But still, we can see the long-term trends, maybe after like the 2030s. And I think the Commission is reconsider that to involve the indirect emissions report and the cost and for like steel and aluminum. So the questions for me is that because I've heard a lot of times from our like the colleagues and the stakeholders and well some like the friends or like the the industrial like the people from industrials, and they said what should be the first priority in responding to these international developments, not only for CBAM but for the JET protocols. And in my personal view, I think that the fundamental research is still needed here in China, because we can see a lot of scientific research from Princeton, from some universities, and they just do very scientific and they build the simulations and to analyze the impact and the advance of the hourly matchings or like the round the clock electricity models. But here China, we still need more, because as David said, the Chinese electricity market is totally different from the other places. So I think our scientists and the researchers needs more time to do some like basic research for that. And we can see that in order to fully like evaluate the impacts on power systems and the industrial cost and also emissions reduction effectives before gradually exploring approaches to fit Chinese own like the situations. I think for now this is very important, but we can also see that also the Jiangsu province and Jiangxi province, they are starting to implement the pilot projects for the hourly green electricity trading. That is very good. But I think another very important thing in such pilot projects is to observe and to evaluate the effectiveness of such like green electricity tradings of hourly matchings. So this is my personal view, because we need more like a scientific research, and I hope and I'm really hoping that the scientists here and the researchers here and to do some research and to evaluate the hourly matchings and around the clock hourly matchings for like Chinese power systems. So here is my personal view for not for CBAM but for all these international rules. We need a fundamental research. So I think we still needs like but we still have to move to the Q&A session, right? Because I've already give you some like questions. But actually I prepared another like the last questions for you, but I decided to skip it and leave the time to the audience, because I see they left a lot of questions here. So let's move to the Q&A sessions only for like 30 minutes or so. So who will moderate the Q&A sessions?
I don't mind. You can do it if you want, Jenny, or else I can do it. I don't mind.
Yeah, so maybe we can see here. I think most of the questions is about the China's electricity markets and also like the here.
Do you want me to do it,
Here's
Jenny? Or do you want to?
or you like you can check that, because we can, or we all can see that the chat.
I
the
can.
chat here.
I can see.
Yeah,
Yes.
I can go with the questions and
Okay,
maybe,
perfect. Yeah.
yeah. So the first question we have is, power users shift their electricity consumption to periods when renewable energy is generated. This may lead to new grid congestion and even new security risks to the power system. So how should this issue be addressed? Maybe this is maybe for David and Killian, both of you can answer this.
Well, I think Killian has probably thought about this more deeply, but so I'll let him go right after this. But my first instinct would be that in general, the lower priced electricity, or the electricity that you are hoping to take advantage of because it's lower priced and available, would be in hours that were it's an issue that already existed. If there was congestion before you had that demand, the congestion isn't going to get better, but it was already there. I'd be more interested in seeing how the hourly or granular matching requirements incentivize moving power away from congested periods, because I think that's typically the actual expected outcome here, right? That especially certain types of renewables overperforming at certain hours of the day was partially responsible for the congestion, and that moving it to a less congested period alleviates the issue rather than exacerbates it. But it is indeed theoretical. So I would maybe see if Killian wants to add something to that.
Yeah, no, pretty much aligned there. You know, in Europe, where you now have for years kind of pretty robust hourly price signals for electricity, we've seen over the last number of years that those spreads, you know, -50 at midday, going up to 250 euro per megawatt hour, you know, 7 or 8 hours later, really signaling that, you know, what we're desperate for in Europe is more flexibility, more alignment between when people want electricity and when electricity is cheap and green. Because we have a lot of grid congestion, we don't have very high levels often of grid utilization, and unlike in China, we find it very hard to build more grids. It just takes a long time here, so we need to use what we have. And again, you know, these more granular price signals are seen by experts and policymakers in Europe, at least, as being absolutely crucial to alleviating grid congestion and ultimately making our grids also more secure and less stressed. So that would be what I actually would take as a perspective as well on that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Killian and David. I think the next question is kind of relevant to the previous one. The question is like, how do you expect adding flexibility resources and shifting to more granular or hourly clean power matching to affect electricity bills for corporate? So that's the question.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in here, right? Like,
Yeah,
all
sure.
all forms of flexibility, all additional assets coming into the system are going to add to end user bills. That's just a fact of life. You expect that your energy price goes down, right? We're introducing lots and lots of low cost, low margin renewables, and then some of the cost of integrating them come back out on the system integration cost side, which includes flexibility. You can get to substantially high penetration levels in some case, depending on where you are in the world, with a lot of wind and solar and very minimal system integration costs. At certain very high levels of penetration, your system integration costs start accelerating quite rapidly. I don't think China's there yet. I think China could still integrate quite a lot of wind and solar and enjoy the lower marginal costs of the wind and solar, while those integration costs do start rising, but still stay very, very minimal. At least several more years of new costs. But yeah, eventually new transmission, distribution, grid forming, infrastructure, inertia, all that stuff does become an issue. And it does start showing up on end user costs, and how you choose to socialize it is a market design question. But certainly in the short term, I wouldn't expect to see too much worry about that. Now, as for the hourly matching question, I'll kick that back over to the EnergyTag guys, because it's quite theoretical. I believe you don't really see much of this in implementation yet. Maybe we'll start getting data from Jiangxi.
Yeah. Thanks,
Yeah,
David.
you know, again, I think if you look at something like it completely depends. The costs again do depend. Like, I'm talking from the corporate procurement perspective. They do depend on how much matching you are actually doing. This is very important. This is the most important thing. If you take one thing from this webinar, please remember that. And obviously, rational corporate buyers. So I used to be an electricity buyer in the chemical sector. You're going to run the numbers and you're going to see, well, what works for us right now. And we're going to kind of go for that as a starting point. In markets where PPAs are like physically settled, which is mostly the case. Anyway, you have to do 15-minute matching or hourly matching just because that's how you're settling your power. And again, as we've shown from the IEA graphics, you can get relatively high levels with renewables and batteries today at costs that are not, out of the ordinary. And again, I'll drop a video in a minute that explains this concept, but it is important to remember that, the more covered you are, the less you would have to buy from, let's say, the wholesale market at prices in 5 years that you have no idea what they will be. Whereas if you're able to cover yourself with a kind of a firm renewable portfolio, that's giving you good levels of hedging. More generally, we basically, ultimately, you don't have any choice but to start doing this clean flexibility and storage stuff once you reach a certain renewable penetration. I put a graphic in there about Germany. It's the same in a lot of European grids. Grids just cannot take any more solar alone. The business case for standalone solar in most European markets is almost dead without adding in more flexibility. So if you want to continue your renewable revolution, you don't have a choice. You simply just have to figure this stuff out. And how to allocate those costs proportionately and rationally. So I think that's just a point. We can't go back from here, I suppose. It's just something we have to figure out.
Yeah. Thanks, David and Killian. Another question
I want
we
to
have
jump
is...
on a question here because I think
Yeah,
Anders
sure,
is
go
quite
ahead.
keen to get his question responded. Maybe he has to drop off soon. Anders, you had a question here about document 834 and how that should be handled. So this is a very recent Chinese regulation about supply chain data and protection of supply chain data. So it's very early, of course. How are we going to reconcile the need to be able to audit claims on green electricity for suppliers or, Chinese-based suppliers with a national Chinese policy that protects that information? So yeah, it's early. It's hard to say how it would be handled. Obviously, they're very motivated to support their exporters who are exporting to the EU. So there's going to be a working solution. It will probably be led and then kind of promoted as best practices by the exporters themselves. I would guess it means most, if not all, of the key data has to stay on Chinese shores, and that whatever is reported is going to end up being aggregated totals of energy consumption, aggregated totals of certificates, and that the overall approach will be to audit the claim being made and not audit the supplier themselves. So the package of data that comprises the claim, which is aggregated and maybe partially anonymized, is the data package that gets audited for compliance, and not individual company, individual energy, individual consumption. I think that's the way it's going to have to work to let those two regimes work together. I do believe the Chinese side, the Chinese policymakers, will be incentivized to find a way to make it work. Although it will probably be up to the exporters themselves, I would think, to propose how to do that, and then eventually work out a best practices that kind of walks the line between what doesn't get on the wrong side of Chinese, it's Article 13, right? Article 13 of document 834, and still meets compliance needs on the EU side. But it's very early, so I'm also being quite speculative here.
Maybe just a quick, I would say from an international perspective. So like there are companies, take for example, Google, who's been actually doing this on their data centers for a number of years. Similarly, that very high granularity based data is highly sensitive, and that's not something that they want, publicly, just put on the internet, let's say. So there's already methodologies being developed. And what matters is what was the matching, not what every single line item of the base data is. So there's already ways of doing this in a way that can satisfy auditors, etc.
Okay, I think we almost reached to the end and have just 2 minutes left. I think rest of the questions we can get back offline. I hope we make a note of the questions separately. So with that, I think let's conclude this webinar cum report launch session today. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today's session, especially the Lantau group, David Fishman and team, for working on this report and Jenny to moderate the session. From EnergyTag side, both Killian and myself, really thank you for this. Plus, as David already mentioned, so China already has many of the building blocks needed for the round-the-clock clean power. We already have rapid renewable growth, storage deployment, spot market reforms, grid digitalization work is going on, and great green electricity certificate framework already, continuously under development. And of course, the report also highlights a lot of these things, including challenges, how stakeholders can address those. So these reports particularly address a lot of this, highlight a lot of this development, plus talks about various challenges and how to overcome those, and also talks about how stakeholders can move ahead with this. So I, along with the team, highly recommend you to read the report. Please download the report. If you miss the QR code, please download it from our website. You already have our contact details, so reach out to us as well as to the Lantau group if you have any questions, and happy to support with your questions. So with that note, thank you. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.